So this session and this little tour has been called the Journey to Life Tour, and the broader title being Taking the Lost and Found on a Journey to Life. Just to immediately unpack a little bit of that to give you an idea of what we're looking at today. This idea of the journey to life ties directly to almost Jesus' mission statement of sorts, that he came to bring life in all its fullness. And from what we can understand from the original text, what Jesus was saying was almost quite an absurd claim in a sense. It was such an extreme statement he was making, an extraordinary accountability to be held to, that was the very thing that he brought. And along with that accountability that people can look towards and see, is this guy really able to bring this about? We as his people also have a certain accountability to ensure that we are fulfilling and making possible that journey to life that he came to bring, and that he is presumably fully empowered by his Spirit. So for every one of us, we're involved in some form of Salvation Army ministry, either supporting it or directly involved at the coalface. And so in this way, we all play a part in moving people forward one decisive step on that journey to life. The challenge for us is, how do we make sure that people continue, both the lost and the found, to move forward further and further to that full experience of life? So we may take someone off the street and put a roof over them and put food in their mouth, but how do we take them the next step forward? And this will involve a couple of different levels. One will be the integration of the ministries we're all involved in, so that we can hand people on that process, but also within our own ministry context, making sure that we are developing and becoming better and better at a holistic care, if you like, for people, and looking at the development, the needs, and what we can possibly meet, but also what we need to pass on to other people to ensure that journey continues to carry forward. Oh, I'm behind myself one. All right, now I know that probably the vast majority of you are familiar with NCD, some perhaps not so much, but either way, I find it very, very helpful to always provide a reminder of sorts that keeps us very clear on what we are trying to do in the development of God's kingdom. What is our part to play and what is God's part to play? Who has seen the pot plant illustration before? Okay, a few people. We can learn a great deal about the dynamics of our part to play and God's part to play by simply observing a little humble pot plant. Who's a gardener here? That is extraordinary. Every single session so far, not a single hand. I think we have found the key to the Salvation Army Challenge. We've just got to hand out some more shovels, and I guess it might be harder in the snow. I don't know. I can't speak to that. But nevertheless, have you seen a pot plant? Yeah. We'll start wherever we can, and we'll move upwards from there. All right, so you might have observed that with a pot plant, there's four main components that we can have an influence over. So the size of the pot, the nutrients available, the water, and the location. So in our little example pot plant here, the nutrients are taken care of quite well, the location's pretty good, the size of the pot's not too bad, the water's a little bit limited, but there is some water there. So what we expect to see is that this plant, to some extent, will grow all by itself, as Mark 4:26-28 reminds us through Jesus' teaching. We are not standing over the plant, pulling it out of the ground. We're not making it grow. We have no capacity to force the plant to grow. We make the conditions right for the plant to grow, and it does what God created it to do. It grows all by itself. Now, of course, this then brings in the relationship of what we do and what God does, because at a given point, it reaches a limitation. So it's run out of water. What do we do at this point? Water it. Very good. Brave answer. And a good answer. So we water the plant, and without any other mystical magic, the leaves sort of stand back up again, and it continues to grow all by itself, just as God has created it to do, until a little bit later it reaches another limitation. So what do we do at this point? A new pot. See, that would seem to be a good idea, but the problem is that we have history on our side, and history informs us about what we need to do. And also the Bible tells us a great deal, because we know that historically we watered and we had a huge effect. And if we return to our Bibles, we read right at the beginning, the Spirit of God hovered over the waters. Yes, of course, water's so important. Moses parted the waters, absolutely. And in every denomination apart from the Salvation Army, Jesus turned what into wine? Water. grape juice or apple juice or some other thing. And of course, we must keep in mind that my grandfather donated the watering can that sits on the back wall of our hall, and he is a person we must honour because he was the greatest waterer ever. And through his time, we were in revival. And so clearly water is the most important thing. And we have it on good authority. We are a watering church, no question about it. Now, as ridiculous as it all is, unfortunately, that is the approach taken in many churches, many organisations, many gatherings of all sorts. We know historically that at a given point in time, there was an incredible effect that came from a particular action. We watered and there was an amazing result. But further down the track, we're still thinking that that is the key to success, when something completely different may be needed. And in fact, it's not just that the water in this instance won't have any effect, but the very measure that was so helpful and successful at one stage in history will actually have a detrimental effect in another phase of history, because all of these components have to exist together. There is a connectedness of all the parts that need to be in place in order for the growth to happen. So the plant itself might get root rot or some kind of fungal disease because it's got too much water now. Now, if we translate that to the church kind of landscape, we've got interesting challenges in mind. And I've worked with churches that have had an incredible experience with a phase of prayer that brought a new revival to the church. And then years down the track, they kind of peter out a bit further and they say, wow, we need to have another time of prayer revival. They're still in their prayer closets all the time, praying in all sorts of ways, but they haven't noticed that they don't cross the aisle to actually speak to each other. So it doesn't matter how much more prayer they do, there's another issue at stake that they need to take care of at that time. So this just reminds us of a very natural way of approaching growth. And it helps us to avoid trying to force growth or to make it happen, but to make ourselves constantly ask the question, whatever level of ministry or involvement you have, to remind yourself, is God at least as passionate or more passionate about that ministry than what you are yourself? And hopefully the answer is yes. If not, you're probably in the wrong area. You should be doing something else. But if God is passionate about that, his desire for that to happen is very strong. Unless we ascribe to some capricious God that sits back and says, oh, well, I'll bless that now. Oh, no, they're doing a good job, but I won't bless that now. Now, it's very important we consider what our view of God is in what we're doing. And if God is genuinely faithful and consistent and has principles he operates by right through the history of time, it's worthy of us to have a little look and to say, what barriers are we putting in place? Because we're not making things happen. We are removing barriers that the Spirit of God would grow up individuals all by itself, would grow up groups all by itself, would grow up core, would grow up centres, would grow up whole division, would grow up the UK territory, would grow up the army as a whole, would grow up the kingdom of God as a whole as we collectively remove the barriers along the way. So, quite clearly, you are correct. See, you would make great gardeners. Awesome, you should try it sometime. So we changed the size of the pot, the roots were getting a bit root bound, and all by itself it continues to grow. We have to change the location because we've had the plant in England and there's no sun, so we moved it to Australia, a different location, and it started to grow. Yes, got to get mileage out of this. But I'm loving it, it's wonderful, it's terrific. I can dress for this. I can't dress for home. It's a disaster. So this whole process is coming clearer and clearer about what is our part to play and developing eyes for the barriers we need to remove with the expectation that God's desire to bring growth is far beyond what we even imagine it could possibly be. And all of this is simply echoed in Paul's words, I planted the seed, Apollos watered, but God made it grow. The clarification of whose role is which. So in NCD, on the basis of the international research, we've translated this all by itself concept from Mark 4:26-28, and having identified 8 life-releasing principles, if you like, from the international research, then we can see that any church, and as we'll expand further today, any type of ministry that is endeavouring to draw people together and keep them together in constructive, fruitful relationship with each other and with God, any organisation like that has to adhere to these principles. So after 20 years, or more than 20 years, we simply can't find exceptions to this, which is what we expected to be the case. So they simply must be addressed. We can't sidestep it. And on that basis, if we take an example, Again, this could be a congregation, or it could be a social centre, or whatever it happens to be. Whatever is most limited will be limiting the development of that particular organisation. At the same time, it will equally be limiting the journey to life of the people who are being ministered to by that organisation. So if we have a core or social centre that doesn't quite have the piece of the puzzle that activates the gifts of people we're ministering to, identifies what God has placed in them, in this example as their gifts, they're going to stumble, they're going to stall on their journey to life. That's going to be their barrier to take the next step. So either we have to find ways in our own context to deal with that, or we have to integrate and connect with other parts of the movement who can do that and help that process forward. Okay, so if we take care of that issue and remove those barriers, we then expect to see the growth continue on this way. So for me, in this realm of church health and development, it's quite funny that, having grown up in the Salvation Army, that there's a connection I never made until a couple of years ago. And it was a very significant connection that kind of ties those two worlds together for me. And it starts with the question, well, what is the Salvation Army? There's plenty of discussion around that, particularly over recent decades. What is our identity? What are our values? If we need to structurally reform, what are the distinctives we have to hold on to? All those sorts of discussions. And I've been involved in some, but I know there's been tons more than that. But if we go to the question of what is the Salvation Army, we have to hone in on that central word, which is the most descriptive part of it. We know what armies are, and that doesn't really add a great deal to it. But the salvation part, what does this really mean? And the thing that struck me is that as the Salvation Army, we must offer the salve. It had kind of escaped me for a long time, that we are the Salvation Army. To stretch that a little bit further, you could quite easily transfer that to say we are the healing army. That would be a very appropriate definition of what we are about. And immediately it provides us a chance for an expanded understanding about what we are meant to do. Because we could say we are the rescue army in one sense, and we may take people from the most destitute circumstances and try to lift them a bit further along the journey, which is part of the healing process. But the healing process of salvation must continue. It must continue further and further along the way. And so in this sense, every aspect, every dimension of army ministry could be reoriented in its thinking, at least, to say we are part of a healing process of people on the journey to life, which is, by definition, the meaning of salvation. The writer, Wesleyan theologian Howard Snyder, interesting being in a Methodist place at the moment, Wesleyan theologian Howard Snyder, in a book he wrote, has written, speaks very, very positively of the army. In fact, it's the one movement that he highlights in a very affirmative sense, about the holistic understanding of the army compared to many other parts of the church who may have an approach to say, get them saved, and get them to say the sinner's prayer, and ideally they'll get to heaven. We don't know much else we'll do with them apart from that. But the army in its roots has a very holistic understanding of salvation. And it's helpful to consider the title of his book, which is Salvation Means Creation Healed. And it's an expansive understanding of that. And it's a terrific thing to consider, because what is creation? Creation are the created people and the created context. So as the army, we try to reform and save people, heal people's lives, but at the same time, we're trying to heal the context in which they live so that their life can continue, so that they can continue to grow. So the reformation of society is part of that overall mandate, and the saving and healing of the people in that context is also part of the mandate. So to hold on to that overall picture is terrific. And for me personally, suddenly these worlds kind of just, join right up. I'm saying, well, my day job is as a church health doctor sort of thing, so to speak. And then to realise that since birth I've been part of the healing army, or in a sense the health army, my world's kind of, reintegrated in a very solid way, which means all the topics we're talking about here about the universal principles of church development or of the development of individual people are absolutely consistent with what we say we are. We are the Salvation Army, we are the Salve Army, we are the Healing Army, we are the Health Army. And so we need to be recognising, just as doctors would do, What is the particular limitation health-wise in this person's life? How do we address that so they can move more and more towards life in all its fullness? Now this connects very directly with, this is a contemporary rendering of that famous picture related to In Darkest England on the Way Out. And we consider all the many maladies and sicknesses and troubles within the world that we are attempting to deal with. What I want to extend to in this context, knowing that this has been in the background of the focus of the Army for forever, is the idea that the lost and found are both subject to many of these challenges. So you may have come off the street, you may have even found Christ, but on that journey there may still be mental illness, there may still be unemployment, there may still be other issues that need to be tackled for you to continue that journey. And we can't afford to settle with moving people to a certain place, and the honour and respect that comes with that, that's terrific. But it's not consistent with the fullness of our name, what we are about. So to continue to move people forward is a critical part, and to address these needs. Now that of course means we have to have the whole picture of salvation in mind. It also means we need an awful lot of people to carry that kind of workload, and an incredibly diverse group of people to manage to try to tackle those challenges. So if we move from this beautiful emotive picture to what's really deeply moving for me, ugly looking bar charts, but it is for me, it's a significant thing. I look at these bar charts and I look through them and I see faces and I see tears and I hear conversations, and that might make me a subject for an asylum, I don't know. But nevertheless, it is a powerful thing when you've looked at enough of these and related it to the experiences of people that are going on behind these pictures. Now this particular profile is the most recent profile. It was produced a couple of weeks ago based upon a considerable sample of corps right across the territory. And so this is the collective profile of what the Army looks like from a corps perspective at the moment in the UK. Now straight away, what I want to address is the question, to what extent would this be relevant beyond corps? To what extent would this have any relevance in centres and other places? Now, of course, the data hasn't been drawn directly from those centres, but I would contend that there is quite a deal of relevance that we could place on this overall profile in the context of other settings for a few reasons. One is, this profile is remarkably similar in shape to the Salvation Army right across the world. So this shape of profile is embedded in my retinas from working with different territories around the world. So the pervasiveness of Army culture is incredibly strong. There are nuances different here and there in terms of different territories. Passionate spirituality, interestingly enough, is counterculturally higher in this territory than in other places, which is terrific. And I can feel that when I meet with you. You can sense the difference. And so there are variations, but in the most part, it's an incredibly strong culture the world over. But more than that, we know that the leaders who have grown up in that environment have both been influenced by that environment and they have influenced that environment. So even if leaders have come through that environment and have ended up in positions of responsibility in non-core related departments, they have both been formed by that and have been people who previously have formed that culture. So within reason, I think we can draw some fairly firm conclusions about an overall cultural picture from this sort of profile, which then becomes quite an inclusive discussion. But if we then take one step further forward and join this with the last picture we were looking at, we can imagine this idea of pulling people from the water, pulling people from whatever it is that's causing them to not experience life in all its fullness, or to even have a sense of drowning in their circumstances, whatever that happens to be at the time. And if we play this out from the far end, your left-hand end, our capacity to pull people from the water, if there are immediate needs that need to be taken care of, is very strong. We are known the world over for that. William Booth pretty much, reinvented the concept of need-oriented evangelism in a very powerful way. So if you imagine we're standing on that pillar of need-oriented evangelism with firm footing, with dry feet, and the ability to reach down and pull people to higher ground within their life, that's very, very strong. We're in a good position to do that, and we do that consistently. We come on a little bit further, passionate spirituality. If they need a sense of hope, an idea of possibility that life could be better, that there is reason to have confidence that things could change. They will get that from people within the army. There is a joyfulness, there is a hope and a possibility that people are drawn to. We can lift them out from that perspective and give them a better footing from there. Now, of course, as you move along this journey to life and all the different parts people will either need as their first step on the journey or as a subsequent step on the journey, it becomes more challenging the further we get, because if we ourselves are standing in the water on slippery rocks with not the strongest footing, our ability to lift people beyond that point becomes markedly reduced. And so when we come down, and today in particular I'll focus on these two lower areas when it comes to effective structures. So our ability, just even in one sense, to pull someone from the water and pass them to another agency in the army who can best help them will be a little bit limited, because the integration of all the parts we do is not especially strong. So straight away that's going to limit part of their journey. But then on another level, in terms of holistic small groups, this is an area related to the nurturing environment where people can be grown, where their potential can be released, where they can discover the fullness of what God intends them to be and have people walk beside them to grow them to that point. Then that's, again, going to be an area of limitation. That might be the first thing they need on the journey. If that's the case, we really can't help them all that much. If they reach that point, having taken the other steps, and then they need that next step to be nurtured further on, we're going to have trouble doing that for those people. So the challenge we have then is that at this stage, we are able to offer a partial journey to life. So we have our Saviour presenting the case that his mission in coming to earth was to bring life in all its fullness. And at this stage, we can help people discover part of that, but we have more we need to do to help that to be fully experienced by people along the way.
Can you ask how many core that was in relation to, that are part of that?
Yes, so what we generally work towards is, in order to get a solid sample, and testing it over the years, we have to reach at least 30 for it to fully stabilise as a sample. So I simply went back on that and took the most recent 30, where it was like to get the most recent so that it's the most recent picture, and so work back from 30. I mean, if we take more than 30, typically there's very little variation that comes into the picture, so it's a sort of a statistical maximum.
We were a bit surprised by evangelism coming out top, and that might well be to be with core that are switched on and are doing it, because I think the core that need to do it, that probably wouldn't be the highest denominator, but it doesn't negate what you said. Yeah,
well, what's interesting is that the value on need-oriented evangelism in the army is through the roof. And so for many in the army, they'd say, oh, I wish that wasn't showing up high, because we've got to be better at that. And I'd say, absolutely, we have to become much better. And there's a lot of headroom for growth within that. But if I take a group of people from the army into some of the other contexts where I minister and say, just sort of feel the vibe of need-oriented evangelism here, and they say, what vibe? There is no vibe. There's no sense of it at all. So even in a low expression of the army in that area, it is actually stronger and therefore felt by people in society as stronger even than in other movements. But certainly we want it to go a long way further north than where it is in all contexts. Okay, I think I've gone backwards. All right, so here's another depiction, another way of looking at these results, exactly the same results from the number 1 through to the number 8, but shown in a different format. So straight away your eyes are drawn to, at the bottom, the high strength and need-oriented evangelism that stands out, and then this lower area in particular of holistic small groups. A very helpful way to look at this overall picture is in a couple of quite sort of colloquial church terms, if you like, and that is that the lowest 3 areas have the strongest affinity to opening the front door. Now, this is not just opening the front door of the core, this is opening the front door in a sense to the whole ministry of the army in whatever context it is. And that front door part is related to the inviting and sending of people. So it's not just opening that people come in, it's opening that we send out as well. So it's both directions. It's saying this is the visible face where we interface and connect with the world and try to transform our surroundings. So that area is really quite developed. Of course, by raising the front door issue, it immediately implies we have to ask the question about the back door issue. And the aim for the back door is to close the back door. And this is then related to embracing and growing people. Now, the challenge we have is that if you have people coming in the front door, but then drifting out the back door, there may be some gain, but then there are also losses along the way. We don't want to bolt the back door shut. We don't want to weld it shut to sort of prevent people getting out. That would be a cult thing to do. So we're not aimed at that. But the idea is that the door remains shut as long as no one's wanting to open it. So if people are moving towards the door and reaching out, and they're saying, I'm just, even I have deep respect for the army, but I just have to move towards this. I can't quite keep going with what I need to be doing. And their hand touches the door, they open the door, and they move outwards. And the extraordinary thing is, you probably had the same experience. I meet people all the time who have background and history with the army, and the vast majority of them continue to speak very positively. Oh, I love the army. It's really, really special to me. They say, but they haven't been in any practical way connected with it or involved in it for quite some period of time. So the respect remains enormous. So it's not like they're all going out the back door disgruntled and hissing and, carrying on, sometimes perhaps, but not in the majority of instances. So we have to say, what do we do about that? How do we address that in some form? Now, if we were to summarise, interestingly enough, the lowest 4 areas in the profile here, there's a bit of a theme that comes through, and I would sort of word it in one sense that those lowest 4 areas are about releasing the potential of our people. So it's one thing to help people, but if you've helped them, if you have input into their lives, you then hopefully have the expectation that something will come out of their lives as well, that they will become co-labourers, that their potential will be released, that as you pour the love of God into them, it will bounce back out, sometimes in forms very different to what you put in or very different to what you expect it to be, but nevertheless the expectation that God has done a work in their life, and wow, how do we unleash that for the broader purposes of the army? So that becomes a general theme. Now, there's a really interesting sort of irony that emerges out of all of this, and that is that the world over, the army is deeply respected and recognised in general terms for its attention to and care for the homeless, people who in one way or another are experiencing degrees of homelessness, whether it's actual physical homelessness or whether it's in some way the destruction of home, and trying to address that and help people from the most extreme circumstances. That's part of the history, and people still recognise that, and that goes on. So the irony in this picture is that we have to, as a movement internally, look at how do we minimise homelessness. Because to some extent we help people out of homelessness to a certain point, but then within our core, and as I would suggest even in our centres, there is a danger of homelessness, a new type of homelessness that emerges, because the next part of what it is to be part of a home, like a child growing up in a home, in the beginning you just meet their most basic needs. As they get older, you say, all right, how do we draw the potential out of the child? How do we stretch them? How do we grow them so they become a contributing member to the family and they feel well bonded into that? So the challenge in this context is that we need to love the lost and found. We need to love those who are found, if for no other reason that we hope the lost will soon be found. So we need to practice loving the found, otherwise the lost they'll just become found, but then to continue the journey they may feel they need to go in some other direction. So if we're going to continue the journey to life, we have to just redouble any efforts towards releasing the potential. If we do all that good work, then it's not unreasonable to expect there will be a return on that, because God's Spirit is working in their life. Something else will come out of that. How do we draw that out and maximise that for the sake of the kingdom? This is a very famous picture used in NCD, and what's intriguing about it is that there's a couple of perspectives you can have. You can look at this and say, oh, that's ridiculous. Look at them working like that. There's all those round wheels there. Can't they see the potential they've got right in front of them? Strategically, they should be taking those round wheels and putting it on. Imagine how much more work they could get done. Now, I'd suggest probably most in the army would have a little bit more of that tendency. But there are other more huggy pastoral people that look at it and say, oh, those poor people. Look at how they're struggling. Look at how difficult it is for them to be doing the ministry they're doing. If only someone could help them. So these two perspectives will become the two streams we continue to look at today. And that is that there is a way of looking at it in a very strategic angle, saying it's insane to not make use of the round wheels. If we want the cart to go further, if we want the mission of the army to go further, if we want to achieve more for the sake of the kingdom, if we want to see more transformation, then you're crazy if you don't make use of the round wheels. But on the other side of it, what if these people pushing the cart are some of those whose hand is reaching towards the back door? They're saying, I still love the army. I've been pushing this cart and it's really, really hard, heavy going, but I'm tired and I can't quite keep going. So I'll just quietly slip out the back door because, and I don't have to disrespect it, but I just can't quite keep up with this because the cart I've been asked to push doesn't really fit me, and no one has helped me to identify that my own gifts might be in the cart, which would make my cart a lot easier to push. But at the moment I'm pushing a cart that probably someone else should be pushing, but I'll do what I can to keep moving with that. So that stream, that pastoral stream, is the one that I'd like to move down first of all. And to ask the question ourselves, to move this right out of the abstract. For you, in your sphere of ministry, you can relate to your ministry area, you can relate to your own family, wherever it is. Who are these two people? Put names on them. These are people from a pastoral perspective that are getting weary, and in a moment they're possibly going to get let go of the cart and they're going to walk towards the door, put their hand on the door and move out the door. So I want you to put real people in that picture, and I'd be fairly confident some of you could think of some people who might be a little closer to that door than what you would like them to be as we consider these next parts. So this is then tied to that lowest area we looked at before of holistic small groups. So we can ask the question, what are holistic small groups? Very important to clarify this so we know what we're actually aiming at and trying to resolve. So we just simply break it down. What is a small group? And we've done a huge amount of research into this in NCD internationally with the benefit of being able to look at all kinds of groups all around the world. And on the basis of that, have been able to bring this down to a very precise definition of small groups. So you might want to write this down. A small group is a group that is small. If you need me to slow down, I'm happy to slow down, just so you can really imbibe that and hold on to that. Now, I say a bit facetiously, but at another level, it's a really critical factor. In the early stages of NCD research, there was one question asked as part of the broader research, which was asked of local church pastors. If your people could only come to one event in the course of the week, either the worship service or the small group, which would you prefer that they would come to? And overwhelmingly, long-term healthy growth, consistent healthy growth, was correlated with those pastors who said the small group. That's, if they can only come to one thing, they must come to the small group. And it points to, we have echoes of this in Jesus' ministry, where he was speaking to the masses, and then he was speaking to the 70. And he wasn't expanding his ministry. He wasn't trying to talk to bigger crowds. He was trying to talk to smaller crowds, to the 70 and to the 12, and then focusing in on the 3. And then by the water, in the end, he's talking to one, Peter, do you love me? Do you get me? Do you understand what I'm saying? And needing to have that quality focus, because that group or team is the nucleus from which everything else comes, because you can build a quality of life into that. And if you want others to experience life in all its fullness, you need to intensify the life in all its fullness experienced by the group you're working with so it can radiate out. Well, you don't have anything you can radiate out. You sort of have life in all its kind of weariness and half exhaustion. That's what we've got to offer. Is that appealing? It's like, maybe not quite so much. So that's the reason for the focus in this area. Now, the fascinating thing about the army is it has an extraordinary number of small groups of all different kinds, possibly more forms of small groups than any movement I work with around the world. So it's not an issue of the accessibility or availability of groups or teams of every different type. It's what do you do when you're actually in that group that's the critical issue. We don't need to go and start a whole bunch more small groups or adopt some new small group model. We've got plenty of groups, so quantitatively we're fine. Qualitatively, we've got to look at something a little bit different. So then that leads to the other question, what is holistic? So in these terms, I would simply say that a holistic group is a group that is whole. So now we've looked at these two massive pillars of the Salvation Army. One is the activist, need-relieving, speak the gospel into the point of need, meet those who are in the most destitute circumstances. That's one of the major wings of the army. Of course, the other is we are a holiness movement. Of course, the English language, you have this problem with the W and the H, whatever else, but essentially it's exactly the same thing. Holiness is about wholeness, the fullness of people, helping to be rounded out to the fullness of who God intends them to be, so that they can have life in all its fullness. That's the holiness dimension. And so it would seem that's the part that we need to rediscover or engage with more fully. So none of this in any possible way is about the army becoming something different. And I do get a bit agitated when I hear anything that moves in that direction. We must become completely different or do something and become more relevant. And a lot of it is really frivolous without much substance within it, saying the fundamentals were clearly really, really successful at a given point in time. And unless God has suddenly changed the rules of the game, oh no, now the kingdom will operate according to these principles. Fooled you. That's a ridiculous picture of God. But if the principles that the army was recognising and living out in the most extreme growth phases of the army, if we believe in God's faithfulness, those principles remain the same, then there's an awful lot about the army that is just fine, and that we, in certain areas, we have to rediscover. So this wholeness sense of people, for people's lives, is clearly an area we have to become much more practical with and not just perhaps speak about as an important thing to us. Now, the one way of looking at this wholeness or holistic nature is the kind of old, it's been around a long time, this kind of head, hands, heart. So when we address a person, are we mindful of addressing their head and their hands and their heart? Or do we just focus our attention in one part of their life? We're just focused on helping them practically, the hands part, or giving them a job practically, the hands part. Or are we interested in them being transformed by the renewing of their mind? Are we interested in them being healed from emotional wounds and being fully restored at a heart level? So are we really covering the whole person? The other thing about this wholeness, and tying this in with the natural kind of theme, is recognising that as human beings, one of the most common activities we do, it is pretty much the most common activity we do, is to breathe. And that's a very helpful reminder for us because we're doing it all the time. From the moment we're born till the moment we're promoted to glory, we're doing that consistently. And that rhythm is a fabulous reminder for us as we engage with others in our groups and teams to recognise that there are phases of inhale and phases of exhale. So if we have a team or a group and we look across the room and Fred's lungs are collapsing from ministry life, then it's probably useful if we're very mindful of that and we can re-inflate his lungs. Give him some time of inhale, otherwise he's going to just completely self-destruct. So at every level, we need to be looking for how do we be mindful of that nurturing influence from an inhale perspective and an exhale perspective, and to recognise which of the two is needed. So someone might have come back from holidays full of energy and bounding in great excitement, and to say, well, that's terrific. Then they need an exhale phase. We need to be drawing the most from them. And the reason for that is that this is all tied to, in one sense, the breath of God, the pneuma of God. So it's not some technical management exercise to manage people in groups or teams. We're talking about the inflow and the outflow of God's Spirit in people's lives. So when people are inhaling, they are inhaling, in a sense, the Spirit of God. It is being breathed into their life. And when they're exhaling, the Spirit of God is moving through them into the lives of other people. And so that respiration within the army needs to become a bit better. At the moment, it's a bit asthmatic. It's a bit, a little bit croaky, and the breathing out is sort of partly there and the breathing in's partly there, but that's all right, we'll soldier on. We'll just kind of keep going. Whereas the Spirit of God is available to breathe in huge drafts of the Spirit of God and to breathe it out powerfully into the lives of other people. So to start getting this practical, we'll have a little bit of sort of discussion amongst yourselves in a moment. We can look at this one side, the inhaling side. What do we mean? So inhaling in terms of head, hands and hearts. In terms of head, getting your mind renewed. That is breathing in a new understanding, being transformed by the renewing of your mind. In terms of hands, getting practical help, receiving practical help, spiritual assistance in a practical way. Inhaling in terms of the heart, getting emotional support. So straight away we're looking at and thinking about, keep returning your mind to those two people that you in your own mind assigned to the front and back of the cart. And we're thinking of those people and where do they sit with this? What are they receiving? What are they not perhaps receiving in this nurture in their team or group environment? We then flip across to the exhale side. From a head perspective, if you have been transformed by the renewing of your mind, we are desperately interested in you offering your unique ideas for collaboration. We want what's in your mind because you are increasingly having the mind of God, and we don't believe we fully individually have the mind of God, so we need a bit from you as well to collaborate and mix together so that we together fully have the mind of God in the things that we're going to move forward with as a movement. And of course, in terms of hands, offering your unique gifts in service. It's not just lending a hand, but that if it's the Spirit of God that determines the gifts that you have, then that's kind of a fixed thing. We don't really have too much of a right to say, oh, no, we'll disregard that. If it's God who has gifted you that way, then we should be giving the respect and expecting that you will be giving in that way and looking for opportunities for you to give. And in the hand perspective, offering your unique passion. What is it that drives you? It's not just the giftedness, but what makes your heart beat faster? What is it that in the overall ministry of the army is your attention drawn towards, and how can your gifts and your mind and ideas be directed towards that? Because we need to harness all of that God is doing in the person's life. All right, so I'd like to have a little bit of discussion time around this. I've assigned some letters to each of them just to make it shorthand for you, so it's a little bit less wordy when you have the discussions. And I want to do this on two levels. So we'll have the first little discussion time and then maybe get some feedback around that, and then the second part as well. The first part is, as a found person, I'm assuming you're all found people in the room. If you're lost, we have the mercy seat here. We can take you further on your journey. But assuming you're a found person, as a found person within the Salvation Army, in which of these 6 areas are you given the greatest opportunity? You personally. Now, this is a moment where you must apply this at a personal level, not some benevolent caring for everybody else. Because remember, we need to make sure that your groups and teams are becoming more holistic, because we hope maybe some of the lost one day will end up in those teams. So we have to practice what it is to make sure they can continue their journey, as opposed to just a sort of a, heavy burdened, it's not real ministry unless I'm bleeding all the time kind of approach. So at a personal level, which of these are you given the greatest opportunity in? And then in which of these 6 areas do you feel you are given the least opportunity? And if more emphasised, which of these 6 areas would make you feel a more valued part of the Salvation Army? Or another language, that you would feel more at home. You would feel increasingly that the Salvation Army was your home, that place that you can't imagine leaving, because it gives you the chance to breathe in and to fully express yourself for the transformation of the world. So we'll switch across to the next question. What I want to do is just simply broaden this out. So in the Salvation Army generally, which of these 6 areas is most emphasised in the ministry or teams or groups? Now, I fully expect there'll be different answers to this, again, on the basis of what I just said, with the nuancing and your individual experiences. But I'm interested if there's a general sense about that. Which of these 6 areas is given the least emphasis? And the critical question behind all this, so what we're saying, from almost 20 years of Salvation Army data via NCD from around the world, with this issue coming up as the main issue over that period of time, albeit with progress made in different places, but it's still the main challenge. This is the principal reason for people moving out the back door. So I'm interested in that last question. How does this lowest emphasis relate to people moving out the back door? What does it actually look like? What happens in that context that ends up, or doesn't happen in that context, that means those steps are taken towards the door and they potentially go out the door? So this is just helping us to sharpen the picture, and you all have, whilst I'm very keen to encourage you to look at how you apply this in your immediate team context for the sake of the people who are in your team or group, because it's essential that you model it there, so that when you go to speak to other people, you're able to share out of your own experiences, not just a theoretical level. That's one layer of application, but the other layer, of course, within the context of your responsibilities is how do you foster that D, and some of the others perhaps as well, to a far greater extent in all the groups and teams that represent everything in your division. And there will be hundreds and hundreds of them of different kinds. And on the basis of that, with making even the smallest degree of progress, we could expect an enormous shift in the fruitfulness of the army as a whole. Either, and keeping in mind those 2 perspectives that we considered a moment ago, whether you approach this from a very pastoral heart, and you don't want people going towards the back door. You care for the two people holding onto the cart there. If that's your orientation and your motivation, you have a very strong vested interest in this topic. If you are more task-oriented and strategically oriented, and that I'm not saying either of them, like both of them are essential, then you also have an enormous vested interest, because that's an enormous talent pool and capacity that's going out the door that's not being utilised for the purposes of the army. So it doesn't matter which motivation you have, this is a critical issue for every single one of us to explore. So if we can step in this a bit further, so at the end of the day, this has to be addressed. So a question I have is, who is going to advocate for these people? From the pastoral perspective, who's going to advocate for these people? Assuming that they are people somewhere near the door, and we want to look after them. We want to bring a much larger focus and attention to drawing out, their ideas and collaboration, or whatever it is that they happen to need, so that they're less inclined to go towards the door. Well, if we return to our overall picture here, I understand you had Alan Hirsch here recently. What country is he originally from? That's right, Australia. So you've had Alan, myself, the Australian cricket team. You guys have had a really tough trot. You've really been under the pump this last week. I'm testing your commitment to the topic.
Yeah, what about rugby?
Yes. Yes, we're not particularly flash in union. That's pretty ordinary. And soccer is pretty ordinary for us as well. But what's intriguing is that if we take this fivefold ministry concept and this kind of biblical typology of the key pillars of ministry within the context of Jesus' church, there is an extraordinary affinity. And interestingly enough, this is a thing I worked on quite a number of years ago. At the time, not with any specific application, it's just as a person that works in categories and patterns, I look in biblical things and I say, I wonder how that sort of fits together. And so in an extraordinary way, there are these incredible affinities, which shouldn't be too surprising, with these foundational principles that are essential for people to make the journey to life, or for organisations or local congregations or centres to be able to assist people on that journey. And so the challenge that stands out immediately is that in the shepherd corner, these are the people that we need to have advocating for the people holding the cart, but also that we need to be advocating for. Because to be a shepherd, and we need to have the proper biblical understanding, this is not just the soft love shepherd side. The shepherd carries the rod and the staff, and they have different functions. There is the protective, caring, nurturing function of one of them, and there is the correcting, disciplining function of the other. So we must kind of make sure our understanding of shepherding is not just some making people happy and is everyone happy in the core and settled, but that the full picture of shepherding contains both parts, that they must keep moving, and the shepherd moves his sheep, and we need to keep them progressing further forward on that same journey. So to capture that and understand that. Now, this raises a point that came up in, I think, the first round of discussion, and that is the issue of who feels comfortable in the current system. Well, generally speaking, people in the sort of evangelist corner to some extent are going to feel more comfortable. People who have a strong passion for shepherding are likely to feel less comfortable. When I approach local core or churches of any kind, and I present their results, I say, here is your maximum factor, here is your minimum factor, and by the way, I'm letting you off the hook because I know you don't care that much about the minimum factor. It's like, oh, no, of course we care about it. No. If you did, it wouldn't be the minimum factor. So we know that you don't wake up in the morning and go, my goodness, I can't wait to get to that group meeting and make sure that everyone is growing, what are their needs, drawing the most out of them, grabbing their potential. That's not what Salvation Army people in general wake up thinking. For the majority, that is. And that's okay, because there's a drive in a different direction. So if it is more of an evangelist, maybe it's a teacher or prophetic, maybe occasionally an apostle type person. But what that means is that you have one of two roles depending on what most motivates you. If you are a shepherd-oriented person, this is your thing. We desperately need you to step up and lead the way to help develop this culture. And if you're not a shepherd-type person, then you need to make a straight path for the shepherds. You need to be on the cheer squad of the shepherds. Why? Because it's in your best interest. If you're an evangelist and the shepherds aren't getting clear oxygen to do what they do, you're running out of evangelists. You're running out of leaders. You're running out of people to do the need relief that the army wants to do. So it's in your vested interest to make sure that if you're not in the other areas, you're at least on the side cheering for them, saying, please, we need you to do that part because it's part of the overall nurturing picture. So these fivefold areas are definitely not silos. They have to work interdependently together because the concerns of any one of them are satisfied by the work of all of the other ones. They have to work together. So that comes to the synergistic effect of it. So the evangelists make sure that there are more evangelists, prophets, shepherds, apostles and teachers coming in the door. They arrive. We don't know what they are when they arrive, but they're arriving and they probably have those orientations. The prophets have a specific discerning role in determining where particular people and what God is speaking into their lives and really getting that spiritual sense of discernment about who is what and who's placed where. The shepherds, of course, play that nurturing role, the supportive, the inhale when needed, and the exhale, correcting, disciplining, growing part when that's needed. The apostles have a collective responsibility to bring people together, to do new things. In the army's history, with the apostolic mode of leadership, they would go to a place, they would gather the people, and they would kind of put it together. And you go here, you go there, fit that together, great. Now as an apostle, I move on, I start to work in a new place. And that was the specific role that those people had. From a teacher perspective, this is an interesting one because teachers instruct. And instruct is very similar to the structural topic. You construct things, you help people put things together in the way that shows how they fit. So if you're a lecturer at the training college or you're preaching, what you're trying to do is put the pieces together so people restructure God's kingdom in their mind. They find where they fit into that picture. They understand the whole salvation story. You are putting the pieces together in that sense. But more than that, it's instructive that in terms of gift-based ministry connected with teaching, we mustn't reduce teaching to the transfer of information because modelling as a form of teaching is a very powerful thing. So how many people in the army have sat next to another musician who modelled for them how to play and demonstrated and showed them how to play? How many people have gone through rehab and have gone to a workshop centre and learned to make picture frames or learned to make particular things, modelling out of giftedness how to do stuff, to teach you how to make things happen. So as far as the paradigms are concerned, in one sense the fivefold starts a little bit from the question of the who, and then to develop those people and enliven those gifts and their tendencies. And so he starts from the end of saying, well, what do we need to address? And so the capacity to come together is extremely strong. So the issue is the shepherds must be empowered to stand near the door. And we all must play a part in that, either finding them and supporting them, or if we are one of them, and saying, wow, I got to get near the door because there are people near the door and I need to make sure that they're being wrapped up and grown and being held in this home and becoming part of this place. But further to that, the others who are not perhaps the shepherds must advocate for the shepherds for their own sake. You may not be into shepherding, but it doesn't matter. You need it to fulfill the purposes of whatever you're excited about and whatever God's put on your heart. So they have to come together. And so the question really is, how are we going to ensure that this happens? How are we going to identify those people? How are we going to make sure that people are clear of the one or the other responsibility they have? That is, either doing the shepherding or advocating and cheering on and elevating the value and importance of the shepherds, because that's a massive part of us re-engaging with ourselves as a holiness movement, as a wholeness movement. And ultimately it's about helping people further along that journey to life and many more people joining that journey to life. As the diversity of Salvation Army ministry expands, consistent with the plurality of needs and suffering and health issues that exist within the world today. So, I ask you to simply imagine fewer and fewer family, friends, co-workers and potential co-workers drifting out the back door. Most of us have family or friends, perhaps even our own children, that have come through the front door, maybe off the street, or have come via the cradle and they've drifted out the back door. So this is not a theoretical thing. We know in most instances this goes to a pretty deep level, and there's no reason for it to be the case, and it can absolutely be adjusted. And if that's purely the motivation from the pastoral perspective, great, run with that. But if on the other side you're motivated by the capacity for the army to fulfill its mandate and the purpose of the kingdom of God, And we can simply imagine how many more of the lost could be pulled from the waters if we better released the potential of the found, if we got the round wheels and put them on the cart and developed our people as far as we could.